One more social science type for you today is Michael Nelson. Every time I listen to Michael, he just kind of blows my brain because he has a way of thinking about things that always gives me pause. I think there's a framework that he's been working on for argument analysis that really helps construct the dialogue around issues like this. So Michael Nelson is with the OSU School of Forestry. He's an ethicist, actually. Can I say that? I can say that. He's an ethicist, and he'll be talking to you about using argument analysis in managing stands over 80. Help me welcome Michael.
When Cheryl first asked me to do this, I said no. And I said, why would you want to talk about this? To be honest, I was motivated partly by a sense that it's not clear we're capable of having this conversation at this point. And then I finally said yes, but whatever you do, don't put me at the end. So thanks. So Cheryl mentioned that I'm an ethicist, I'm a philosopher by training, so when I think about questions like should we actively manage in stands over 80, to me that's an ethical question because it has the word should in it. And that when you ask a question like that, people are going to have ideas about whether we should or should we not, and they're going to offer arguments, and we can analyze arguments, and so we can come to a decision through a very deliberate and rigorous and systematic process, or we can come to a decision through a dumb and non-rigorous process. So this is our choice. Where's the down? No. Oh, that way, yeah. Okay. So essentially, we're just generally entertaining the idea of doing something. Whatever X might be here, it's actively managing in stands over 80. And of course, as I mentioned, we want justifications for doing something. This is really basic stuff. But it's amazing how often we mess up the basic stuff. And when we offer justifications, they don't stand on their own, and all justifications are not created equally, and they're not just a matter of opinion. They can be evaluated. They can be evaluated formally. So that's what we are interested in doing. And the first thing that we should think about is, well, what is it that we're actually proposing to do? What is this X of which we are speaking? And it actually, when we sort of pause and think about it a little harder, I think it gets complicated kind of quick. Not that that stops us. We should work our way through this. And each one of the arguments might actually be a response. We might not be talking about harvesting in all of the arguments. So are we actually talking about actively managing? Are we talking about thinking about actively managing? Are we talking about actively managing some of the forests over 80? Which ones and why those and not others? Are we talking about actively managing all of them, any and all forests over 80? Is 80, why 80? Is 80 arbitrary? Is it relevant? Why is that the age cutoff? Are we talking about active management, or are we actually talking about logging and timber harvest? Are we talking about stands over 80, or are we actually talking about late serial old growth, and this is just a convenient way to have that conversation? So I said I'm interested in arguments and analyzing arguments. What do I mean by that? I realize the moment I say that, you start thinking, oh, family reunions, that must be fun. But those are arguments. They're not necessarily good ones or ones that we make much traction on, but we can. There's no reason we have to have arguments that way. This is an argument, right? All birds, P's are premises and C's are conclusions. Premises are evidence that we offer to support a conclusion, and there are rules of argumentation. All birds have wings is one premise. Robins are birds is another premise, and therefore robins have wings. It's not a very complicated argument. I think if all family reunions only revolved around arguments like that, although we might have families where even that would be contentious. So premises and conclusions. And the point about an argument is, unless you have both of those, you do not have an argument. So if you just say, I think we ought to do X, you have a conclusion, but you do not have an argument. It's a conclusion lacking an argument. You can get elected to Congress that way, but you should not be allowed to engage in serious natural resource decision making. So it's a set, it's a collection. You have to have both of those things. And again, just because you have an argument, it doesn't mean it's a good one. There's another step involved. So think about premises like evidence. They are things that you need, things that must be true in order for that conclusion to be true. So there are lots of things you could think of as possible premises or relevant, but what needs to be true in order for a certain conclusion to be true? So an ethical argument is an argument that has an ought in it. The conclusion is expressed with the word ought or should. It's prescriptive in nature. So drunk driving endangers the lives of others. A second premise would be you should not endanger the lives of others, therefore you should not drive drunk. If you have a should or an ought in a conclusion, which you do in almost every single natural resource issues, you must, by virtue of logic, have a should or an ought in one of your premises. You cannot magically introduce variables in the summation of your conclusion. We try to do this with all of our might. We say, if we just do a whole bunch of science, then we'll know what we ought to do. No, we won't, just by virtue of logic. It's not my logic rules, it's Aristotle's logic rules. And you don't want to mess with Aristotle. I'm easy to mess with, but not Aristotle. So you have to have both kinds. You have to have factual, empirical statements, and you have to have normative statements. There's no way to avoid it. So think about conservation. Conservation is, we are confronted with questions like we should use these water resources in this way because, or we should try to conserve this wildlife population in this way because, or we should engage in active management. Active management stands over 80 because. Conservation is, in fact, I would argue, environmental ethics in action. This is what we're doing. We don't often treat it that way, but it is. So when I say that arguments can be analyzed in a formal and rigorous sense, what do I mean? Well, the good news is there are only two ways that an argument can be wrong. You can either make a mistake in the inference, right? You can try to arrive at a conclusion for which you have not provided adequate evidence. Many of us do this in our daily lives. It's often pointed out by our spouses. Or you can just make a factual mistake. You can make a mistake in one of your premises. That's the good news. The bad news is there are kind of an infinite number of ways to make those mistakes. But that's all we're looking for when we're analyzing or we're entertaining whether an argument is a good argument or not. So here's an example of a mistaken premise. So this argument is actually valid. If all the premises are true, this conclusion follows from the premise. All presidents, U.S. presidents live in the White House. Lady Gaga is the president of the U.S., therefore Lady Gaga lives in the White House. As tragic as it is, premise 2 is simply not true. So here's a different kind of argument, just to sort of lubricate our minds a little bit. Prostitution promotes economic development. We should promote economic development, therefore we should promote prostitution. So this would be an argument where we would think, wait a minute, that seems like it's a good argument, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that conclusion. And so I might think, there's something wrong with this argument. And what's wrong with it is premise 2 is not quite stated right, is it? It's actually, you need a stronger statement of premise 2 to get that conclusion. You have to say, we should do anything and everything that promotes economic development. And then you might think, oh, premise 2 is not correct, that we can imagine things like this that we might not want to do in order to secure economic well-being. So when you go to think about the arguments that might support or dismiss the idea of actively managing stands over 80, there are, since you can combine words in a nearly infinite number of ways, there are an infinite number of arguments that you could entertain to support that conclusion. So this is actually not representative in the sense that this circle is really nearly infinite. So we need to whittle it down. We want to entertain a set of all good arguments, and that's actually a lot smaller. Of all the stuff we can say, the sensible stuff we say is a subset of that. We want to entertain arguments that might be influencing people or are likely to influencing people, or the arguments that we actually hear on the street that we think are players, and those are the ones that we want to evaluate. So we might do some social science work to figure out which ones those are. So I did some really bad social science work this last couple of weeks to figure this out. I just sort of asked people who are invested in this topic, when you think about this or when you talk to people, what are the kinds of reasons that people are offering for why we should actively manage and stands over 80, and what are the kinds of things that people would say that would stand in opposition to that? And so these aren't arguments, they're just reasons. And this is what we call the reason table. We just want to brainstorm this. What are the things that are on people's minds? And we just sort of list all the possible things. So these are from real sources, and I did solicit them, but I didn't get IRB approval or anything. It's just, these are real things that people are thinking about. And then actually laying out arguments and analyzing them is an enormous amount of work. So you want to think carefully about which ones you're actually going to entertain. And you want to have a sort of system of thought to say, yes, we're going to entertain that one, we're going to develop and analyze that one, and not that one. So doing all of these would take a lot of time. So I just picked a couple to demonstrate how we might do this. If we're really seriously entertaining this possibility, how would we work through the arguments to come to a conclusion? The ideal here is that we don't know what we believe about this topic until we systematically work through arguments that support or oppose it. And I realize that that doesn't sound like a very, that I should make up my mind about things only after I actually seriously and rationally consider those things. But by and large, that's not how we operate. So I realize I am suggesting something different. And one of the reasons I said no to Cheryl is I'm like, I don't have any idea what I think about something like this. I haven't worked through the arguments. So I just picked a couple. That active management will enhance fire resilience. And I went back and forth with my co-author on this, Chelsea, and just figured out, what would the argument possibly look like? I'm not pretending we have it right, and that's part of the process, is I would say, here's what I think you're saying, here's what I think the argument looks like. How would you change it? Am I getting this actually right? I want to make sure that the argument that I create is valid and representative of your position. But it's a conversation that we're having. Before we're going to analyze it, we're actually going to make sure we get it right. Which I realize also sounds like it seems to be common sense, but that's seldom how we operate as well. So I think it looks something like this, that historically late serial old growth stands would not be dense fire prone as they are today due to fire exclusion. Premise 2, dense fire prone forests are a threat to human health and well-being, especially in a warming, drying climate. Premise 3, threats to human health and well-being should, notice I have to have a normative premise here, should be eliminated when it is possible and reasonable to do so. So there's a general normative principle that's at stake here. P4, it's both possible and reasonable to reduce uncharacteristic fuel loadings by harvesting and select older stands for the purpose of building fire resilience. And the conclusion is, therefore, we should harvest in older stands to build fire resilience. Notice the variable might be older stands. It might not necessarily be stands over 80. That might be more arbitrary now. You might be talking about something else. And so the first thing we would do is if you thought this was a great argument, I would say, did I get it right? Is this right? And then I would ask questions. I would ask you to evaluate the premises. Are there any premises here that either are wrong or that we just actually don't know the answer to those premises? The fact that we don't know the answer to a claim is reason not to believe the argument as well, but it does identify maybe some research that we might do. So we can think about that. We can think, I would either change this argument or I would not like it because I think there's a mistake in it. So that's one example, enhancing fire resilience argument. You can give them little names like in the enhancing fire resilience argument if you want. You can get more clever than that too. What about this one? We're equal opportunity argument developers and abusers, so we can jump back and forth on the argument table. Active management in stands greater than 80 leads to active management in old growth. It's what we might call a slippery slope argument. If we do this, pretty soon we're going to be doing something else, and that's not a good thing. That's the general form of the argument, but it would be, more formally, it would look like this. Federal forests over 80 should not be actively managed without a good reason. It should not be actively managed without a good reason. So I'm going to start right away with my normative claim, or one of them. There are a small handful of good reasons for active management in federal forests. Maybe I'd be generous and say I can imagine good reasons to do this. P3, allowing active management in federal forests greater than 80 for any or all of those good reasons brings with it the risk that old growth forests will be actively managed for those same reasons, causing significant harms to late serial old growth. P4, the potential benefits of active management in federal forests greater than 80 do not outweigh the potential risks to old growth. Therefore, I guess there was another premise. Management practices whose potential risk outweigh its potential benefits should not be pursued. Therefore, federal forests greater than 80 should not be actively managed. And we can imagine people being concerned about this, and I'm not suggesting that we necessarily nailed the argument that they have, but it's roughly the argument what they have. And again, now we sort of think, are these premises good? Should we be persuaded by this argument? And finally, just one more example. Mature forests are on the right trajectory toward old growth. So this idea that there's a future old growth argument that seems to be lurking here. There's currently a critical shortage. One claim would be there's currently a critical shortage of late serial old growth forest on the landscape. P2 forests greater than 80 on federal lands represent the most promising, I mutilated the language there. It's supposed to be normal English, but it's not. Are the most promising for recruitment into future late serial old growth in the shortest amount of time. Private lands currently sustain most of the timber industry in the region. Because private lands prioritize economic objectives, there must be a counterbalance on federal lands prioritizing ecological objectives. Therefore, restoration of late serial old growth should be prioritized over timber production on federal lands. This is a complex argument in the sense that you arrive at a conclusion, but it's not your final conclusion. P5, harvesting forests greater than 80 would prioritize economic timber objectives over ecological late serial old growth restoration objectives. Therefore, forests greater than 80 should not be harvested on federal lands. So I tried to pick arguments that I think probably are on people's minds. And like I said, we didn't spend an enormous amount of time on this because you'd really want to ground truth this in a way. You'd come up with a draft and then you'd ask people, how would you modify it, how would you tweak it, and then there'd be an evaluation. And of course, you can do this, with all of these arguments. I just sort of, took each one of these in kind and just give you. I'm not going to go through these, but you can do all of them if you want. So the basic take-home message or the basic argument, I guess, is that we shouldn't be afraid of entertaining anything. But we should probably do it in a certain way. And there are ways to kind of maturely and rationally work your way through a problem, and then there are ways that we normally do it, and they're often different from one another. But I think of this as a decision-making model, and I think of it as a decision-making model that's actually worthy of us as rational and moral beings. There is actually a way to do this. We don't see this alternative very much, but there's no reason that we can't entertain this as an alternative to how to have conversations and how to arrive at decisions, as potentially uncomfortable and unfamiliar as it might be. That's all I got.
Any questions for Michael?
Have you ever seen this process used in, say, a lawsuit or developing a forest plan to help carry an argument along?
No.
Do you think it would be successful in future projects to do this with the public or public?
I was just trying to think of lawyers and rational argument analysis. Sort of funny. There is a use of it in a way, right? You are expected to present arguments. The goal is different. The goal there is to win. And the goal in doing this really seriously is to actually find out the truth and to come up with good arguments. It's not about winning. You don't even know what you want until you've gone through this process. I have colleagues, and we've used this and tried to use this with questions about wolf management in the Midwest and in other places. So, we are kind of infiltrating these challenging issues. People are intrigued by it, but it is very unfamiliar, so we're not quite sure what to do with it. I'm supposed to go to Point Reyes and help and do this with their issue on Thule elk. So people are interested in this, it seems like, but we're just at the beginning of it.
Go ahead, couple more.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So one thing I've noticed in natural resources is that people are really passionate about whatever it is that they believe experience or profession or whatever gives people such strong biases that support their own emotional beliefs that they end up being blind to opposing arguments. They're just completely blind to rational arguments on the other side of the issue, whichever side they're on. I mean, do you have a strategy or recommendation to help people get around that? Because we really want to see all sides.
Yeah. I think in a way the commitment that one has to a premise, whether it's a normative value premise or whatever, in some ways is not, I mean, it's relevant, but it doesn't win the day. A premise isn't true just because I really, really believe it. That's not the case. So what the method is, ultimately what the method is really about is transparency. It's really about transparency. What is it that you believe that you think leads to this conclusion? You're passionate about it, that's fine, but I want to know what is it that you believe, and then it's an evaluation. So if in fact what's driving you is a normative premise, show it. I mean, lay it bare. And if what's driving you who are on the other side is also a normative premise, but you're pretending not to be passionate, you got to lay that bare too. And then together what we do is, I mean, in some ways I don't want to use the word dispassionate as a bad thing, but it's a very objective process in that once we have the argument, then you and I both stand back and we look at it and we say, is that actually a good argument? And I'm not talking about you and you're not talking about me, I'm talking about the argument. And yes, I'm talking about what it is that we, at the end of the day, should believe or shouldn't believe, and that's a personal thing, but I can have that conversation a very, very different way than we normally do.
Along those lines, and this is so familiar, when, for instance, there are people who have a value that would say it is immoral to produce an economic commodity off of federal forests. So cut a tree, but don't sell the tree.
Yeah.
And there are people who hold that as a value. To me, that's the values versus the evidence-based premise. Those are two very different things. And so we end up sort of covering over those value bases and putting forth all these premises that may or may not be true. But it seems like eventually you got to get down to the value. I mean, as a federal forest manager, the law says, well, yeah, we want you to get some, renewable resources off the forest. So.
Yeah, you do. I mean, that's the point about transparency, is that if a premise is driving an argument, you have to lay it bare. And it is the fact that some kinds of premises, what we think of as scientific or empirical premises, are very different kinds of premises than what we think of as value premises. The fact that they're different doesn't mean they're not both necessary and that they're not both driving a decision, nor that they both cannot be evaluated. They absolutely can be evaluated. And in some arguments, the scientific premises are actually going to be far more uncertain than the normative premises. If the normative premise is about doing harm to children, that's probably one we agree on a lot more than we agree on some scientific claims. So we have to be really careful about the assumptions we make about normative and scientific premises. If they are both necessary, we need to treat them in a certain way. We have to avoid some of the, well, sometimes stereotypical and sometimes just wrong things that we say about those kinds of claims.
You started out with a list of arguments, favoring conservation, and a list of arguments favoring active management. And hypothetically, we go through the process, we own each of these arguments, we throw some out because they're no good, but we end up with a set of solid arguments on both sides. How do we then harmonize and integrate those two lists to come up with a decision?
Yeah. I think you're being. I think you might be being a bit optimistic. I know it doesn't sound that optimistic, but it's often the case that even what seem like reasons that are persuading people actually turn out not to be very good arguments. And so it's actually possible to go through this process and find arguments that are, bad arguments are on both sides. Some arguments can be made better, and sometimes they can be made better by scientific research. They depend upon a claim about the working world that we don't actually know the answer to. That can actually backfire too, because you can find out that argument's bad as a result of that. So the subset of good arguments is actually really, really small. You know, the odds, I'm not sure I've ever been engaged in a process where we really come out with a set of arguments for and a set of arguments against, and we don't know what to do. The end result tends to be much more obvious than that at the end of the day. I mean, I can imagine that dilemma. That'd be a great dilemma to have. It'd be fascinating, but it's not one we actually confront all that much. Way in the back.
So the Fish and Wildlife Service version of adaptive management is strategic habitat conservation, and there's a structured decision-making process. Are you familiar with
Yes.
that? And does this play into that? And it's a double question. And how does this play into the weighing of alternatives in management planning?
Yeah.
That might be for you or any management planner in the room.
I mean, it plays into it in the sense that both of those are a decision-making process. And the nice thing about structured decision-making is it demands clarity or transparency in the claims, and it recognizes that some of them are normative claims. The thing about this is it's better. Because you're actually evaluating the argument. Sometimes in structured decision-making, it's still very, very descriptive. And again, the benefit is it has to be fully descriptive, and that's wonderful, better than not being fully descriptive. But sometimes, very often, you're not evaluating parts of it. You sometimes are ranking parts of it, and then you build it into the decision. But sometimes it rings hollow, because at the end of the day, even though you're transparent, it's not clear that you actually evaluated parts of the argument, or that you had the right kinds of conversations. So you described how people would weight values, but you never had the conversation about how we ought to weight values. That's a different conversation, and that's one we tend to avoid because we're not very good at dealing with values. So that's you know, I think of this. I mean, I actually do think of it as better because it's really aimed at trying to arrive at a decision and not being afraid of those thornier issues that are absolutely critical. We can't avoid those.
Could it be used within? Do they come together or not?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I could imagine it. Yeah.
I should let you off the hook.
All right.